Okay, so we're looking at Piliavin's study today. So it's quite a quick, nice and easy, straightforward study. So there's a link here that I want you to watch first, and it is an experiment called the smoke-filled room. So what I want you to do is watch the video and then answer these questions underneath. And some of this may make sense to you a little bit more when we look at some concepts in a second. So pause the video here and go and watch that and answer these questions, please. Okay, so the idea behind this study is that you are looking at this idea of how we respond to people in need. So there are lots of ways that you could respond to people in need. So the two most kind of common ways are you can be altruistic, and by altruistic we mean that you are doing something good, doing a good deed perhaps, just because that's the right thing to do. So you're not doing it to get any kind of reward, you're just doing something right and good because that's what's themed by the situation. Or you just might not help at all. So there's some key terms for you to note down, and you may be able to apply some of these to that smoke-filled room. So the first key term is pluralistic ignorance. So this is the tendency for people in a group to mislead each other about an emergency situation. So for example, in that smoke-filled room, you could see that the lady was kind of looking up at the smoke. She was then looking around the room to see how everyone else was responding, and as nobody else was responding to it, she just carried on about her business. So actually, if it seems like a genuinely ambiguous situation or plural ignorance, is occurring, then actually you might be less likely to define a situation as an emergency, and therefore you don't do anything. Additionally, you've got this one, so this is diffusion of responsibility. So this is quite an important one for this study. So this is where the responsibility for behaviour is shared between those present. So actually this suggests that the more people who are present at the time of an emergency situation, for example, the idea is that the more people that are there, the less personal responsibility you feel, and therefore you're less likely to help. So for example, if you are walking around in the street, there's 100 other people on the street and someone falls down, then actually you only accept kind of 1% because there's 100 other people there. So you accept 1% of the responsibility for that situation, for helping that person. So in that situation, the idea is that you're probably not very likely to help because you know that 99% of the responsibility doesn't fall on you. Whereas you may say that if there's only 2 of you on the street when this person falls down, 50% of the responsibility is yours, and therefore you're far more likely to help. And finally, you've got the bystander effect or bystander apathy. So this is a social phenomenon where individuals don't seem to offer any means of help in an emergency situation when there are other people present. So you may kind of show bystander apathy in the sense of you might think, well, somebody else will do what's necessary, therefore there's no need for me to step in. So the background to this, and you may need to know this information if you get asked for the key event or stimulus which preceded this study by Piliavin, is the murder of Kitty Genovese. So Kitty Genovese was murdered over a period of 30 minutes where 38, and we know it's at least 38, there could be more, unresponsive witnesses watched this from their homes. So Winston Moseley was the murderer, and he said that he was aware that people had seen him, but he knew that nobody would do anything. And so people since have looked at this concept of good Samaritanism. So the idea of are you going to help somebody in need? So there's a few pieces of background research here. So Darley and Latane looked at this idea of diffusion of responsibility. So they used somebody who was having an epileptic seizure, and they demonstrated that those who believed that there were others present were less likely to help than those who believed that they were on their own. Latane and Rodin also looked at somebody who fell down, and they said that if you had already met the person who fell, you were more likely to help them than if you didn't know them at all. And other research by Bryan and Test showed that you're more likely to be a good Samaritan if you've just seen somebody else be a good Samaritan. So if you've just seen somebody help, you're more likely to go and be helpful yourself. So really what this research aimed to do was it aimed to demonstrate good Samaritanism, or investigate good Samaritanism in real life conditions. So a lot of the research that had been done was in kind of lab settings. And they also wanted to investigate the effect of several variables. So they wanted to investigate the type of victim and the race of the victim, but also to kind of mimic some of the research that had been done before by looking at the idea of someone setting an example. So if you've just seen somebody help, are you then more likely to go and help? And also that idea of diffusion of responsibility by looking at the number of witnesses. So this is a field experiment because it was done on the New York subway. Okay, so just for anybody who doesn't know how subways or undergrounds work, you basically have different coloured lines, and a train will run just on that line. So for example, here you've got a blue line, you have got an orange line, and on the New York subway, all blue lines kind of travel the same set of track, but they don't all stop at the same stops. So some will stop at every stop, some will just stop at key stops, some will stop at popular stops. So the colour, like the blue, represents the fact that it's that line, and the letter represents kind of the journey along that line that it takes. So this was the 8th Avenue New York subway. Okay, and it was trains A, so this one, and D. And they started, so they got on these trains at 59th Street, and they got off at 125th Street, and this journey lasted about 7.5 minutes. Now this journey here was picked specifically because it is a 7.5 minutes stretch if you're on the A train and the D train, a 7.5 minute stretch where you are not going to make any stops. So that means that you have a captive audience, because nobody can get off the train and nobody can get on the train until you get to 125th Street, or if you're travelling in the opposite direction, until you get to 59th Street. So there's quite a few independent variables and dependent variables in this study. So the first one is the type of victim, so whether they were drunk or carrying a cane, so drunk or ill. The second is the race of the victim, black or white. The effect of a model, now that was broken into two, so that is how quickly a model acts, and also where the model was standing at the time that they decided to act. And last one, which is naturally occurring, is the size of the witnessing groups. That would be the number of people who were in that carriage at that time. And what we're measuring is the frequency of help, so how many people helped, or how often did helping occur, the speed of help, the race of the helper, sex of the helper, people who moved away from the victim, and verbal comments made by bystanders. So that's a bit of qualitative data there. So the sample was 4,450 men and women on the New York subway. So they basically made this journey several times a day between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. On weekdays between April 15th and June 26th, 1968. So they recorded the proportions of races on each of these trials, and about 45% of people were black, and about 55% of people were white. So they did between 6 to 8 trials on any given day, which means that we got 103 trials in total. The victims, so the people who played victims, were general studies students. So they were all male, 3 of them were black and 1 was white. And they were all aged between 26 and 35 years. Now, they all dressed alike, so they wore Eisenhower jackets. If you Google Eisenhower jackets, you will be familiar with them. So it's basically like a jacket that's styled like an old army jacket. Old trousers and no tie. And depending on which condition they were acting out, if they were in the drunk condition, they smelled like liquor and carried a liquor bottle wrapped tightly in a brown paper bag. Or if they were in the ill condition, they appeared sober and carried a black cane. Now, it's worth saying that they acted identically in both of these conditions. So they did not act drunk in the drunk condition. And so please do not say that, because that did not occur. They acted the same, but they dressed the same. And the only thing that was different was the items that they carried. So you may want to kind of sketch this out and make the annotations that are around it. So this is how that carriage was laid out. So you've got the critical area, so this is the area where the events occurred, and then the adjacent area, which is the rest of the carriage. So there were 4 teams of 4 researchers. So there was 2 female observers in each team and 2 males in each team. So one of these males was the model and one was the victim. So the victim would enter the train and they would stand in the centre of the critical area next to a pole in the centre of the carriage. The model, depending on which condition they were in, would either stand in the critical area or the adjacent area and would respond either early or late. So after 70 seconds or 150 seconds. The observers sat in the adjacent area. So observer 1 sat here, quite close to the critical area, and observer 1 was responsible for noting down the race, sex and location of every rider seated or standing in the critical area, and also recorded the number of helpers and their sex, race and location. So she was focusing on the who helped and where did they come from. Whereas observer 2 coded the race, sex and location of all people in the adjacent area, and she focused on timing. So she recorded the latency of the first helper's arrival after the victim had fallen. So where the victim fell down, basically how long did it take for someone to help? And in conditions where the model had to step in, she would also record the latency of the first helper's arrival after the model. So how long after the model did it take for somebody else to respond? So they sat there and they kind of made discrete observations with notepads, and they were trying to elicit comments made by other kind of passengers. So the models were all white. They were all males, aged 24 to 29. They all wore informal clothes, but these clothes weren't the same. So they were dressed informally, but not the same as each other. And they only helped if the victim wasn't helped by anybody else. So we have 4 combinations of the 2 model variables. So we've got critical area early, critical area late, adjacent area early, adjacent area late. So write those down. And the female observers, like I say, recorded comments that were spontaneously made by passengers, but also attempted to elicit comments made by people sat next to them. So how the victim behaved. So the victim, as I say, would enter the critical area and stand next to a pole in the centre of the carriage. Now, as I say, this train didn't make any stops. It did go through stations, but it did not make any stops. So after about 70 seconds, which is roughly the time that the train would pass through its first station, the model would stagger forward and collapse. So there were 65 trials of the ill victim and 38 trials of the drunk victim. So there is some imbalance there. I'll explain why in a second. So until the victim was helped, he remained supine. And by supine, we mean he's lying on his back, so face and torso facing upwards on the floor, looking at the ceiling. If he received no help by the time that the train stopped, then the model would help him to his feet. Okay, so that would presumably be at the end of the 7.5 minutes. So, for example, that might be done in the conditions where there was no model, because sometimes there was no model. And at the stop, the team would disembark. They would wait separately until everyone else had left the station, and then they would change platforms to repeat the process in the opposite direction. And as I say, this was done roughly 6 to 8 times a day. Now, as I say, these trials were imbalanced. There were more cane trials than drunk trials, and that is purely because Team 2 violated the instructions that they were given, in the sense that the victim said that he didn't like playing the drunk, and therefore they did more ill trials than they were supposed to in place of the drunk trials. Now, ideally, researchers would have liked to have gone back and corrected this by doing more drunk trials. But actually there was some student strikes, which meant that actually then they weren't able to correct this. So that's just the reason for that imbalance. So in terms of findings, the type of victim did appear to influence the likelihood of helping. So the cane victim received spontaneous help 95% of the time, whereas the drunk victim only received it 50% of the time. And by spontaneous help, we mean that no model had to step in. So overall, there was 100% help for the cane victim compared to 81% help for the drunk victim. And help was also offered more quickly to the cane victim, so a median of 5 seconds compared to 109 seconds for the drunk. Now, on 60% of trials, when help was given, it was given by 2 or more people, and 90% of the first helpers were male. Now, black and white victims were equally as likely to be helped. So it wasn't that white people were helped more or anything like that. But there was a slight tendency for same race helping, particularly in the drunk condition. So if the victim playing the drunk was black, they were, slightly more likely to be helped by a black victim. And similarly, if they were a white drunk victim, then they were more likely to be helped by a white person, but only slightly. And in terms of race of helpers, 64% of the helpers were white. Now, we cannot say from this that white people are more helpful. And why that is because remember, there were more white passengers than there were black passengers. Okay, so 64% in comparison to actually 55% of the people on the trains were white isn't really significant. In terms of how fast they were helped, help was spontaneously offered overall 79% of the time. So this means that on most of the trials, the model didn't have chance to act because it was offered before the 70 seconds. So actually this means that we are not able to effectively test the presence of the model because only on 21% of trials did the model have the opportunity to act. So we can't really come to any kind of finding or conclusion about how the model helping actually influenced others. And in terms of group size, interestingly, we didn't find any diffusion of responsibility. In fact, we found the opposite. So a lot of times, the trains that had the most people on were the ones who acted faster. Remember, we also said we got some qualitative comments. Now, most of these comments were made by female passengers, mostly in the drunk condition, and usually in the first 70 seconds. So women would state things such as, "It's for men to help him. I wish I could help him, I'm not strong enough. You feel so bad you don't know what to do. They also recorded where the passengers left the carriage. Nobody did leave the carriage, but quite a few people, particularly in the drunk condition, moved further away from the incident. So they were standing in the critical area and moved into the adjacent area. So how we explain this is, in an emergency situation, we think there is some kind of emotional arousal. So in other words, you experience an increase of some kind of emotion. That could be empathy, sympathy, fear, disgust, and that depends on different aspects of the situation, which of these emotions you feel. There are things which can increase the amount of arousal that you feel. So if you feel empathy with that victim, so you might have been in a similar situation and you understand how they feel, perhaps. It could also be that you're close to the situation. So if you're standing in the critical area, or the longer it goes on, the more kind of emotion you may feel. And decreased arousal. So decreased arousal occurs if you help, or if you get help, or if you leave. So actually, the idea behind this arousal cost reward model is that you've experienced this increased arousal. So in order to decrease the arousal, you either need to decide to help or get help, or leave. So you do a cost reward analysis in order to decide which of these to do in order to decrease your arousal. So you think about the idea of helping and not helping, and you weigh the costs of these and the benefits of these against one another. So if I was to help somebody, and actually that means that I've got to put in some effort. It means that I might embarrass myself. So actually, if I'm a woman and I've seen a male victim and I've got to try and help him up off the floor, I might feel embarrassed because I might struggle, or I might even hurt myself. Or if it's a drunk victim, I might feel embarrassed because I might feel like people are judging me, because why are you helping a drunk person? But the rewards, the benefits of helping are, I might feel good about myself afterwards. Onlookers might be like, well done you, or the victim might thank me. So it's kind of a good feeling to help somebody. Whereas if I thought about not helping, then the costs of that are, I might feel guilt, I might feel like others are disapproving of me because they're thinking, why is that person not helping? But the benefits of not helping, I'm not putting myself in any kind of danger, and it's not inconvenient. So there's a few kind of conclusions that we need to know. So firstly, an individual who appears ill is more likely to receive help from someone who appears drunk. So actually, we might kind of do that cost benefit analysis in our head and say, actually, I'm going to help the ill person, because in terms of the benefits of helping the ill person, people are more likely to say, well done you, I'm more likely to get thanks from the victim. I'm going to feel really good about myself because I helped that vulnerable person. So the benefits, the rewards there might outweigh the costs. Whereas actually, the victim who appears drunk, people might judge me for helping a drunk person. I might get hurt helping a drunk person because somebody who's drunk might be unpredictable, and I'm not going to feel as good necessarily afterwards, because people might be like, well, he brought it on himself, there was no need for you to help him, therefore I'm not going to get as much praise. Okay, so actually the costs might outweigh the benefits. We can also conclude that with mixed groups of men and women, men are more likely to help than women when it's a male victim. So again, that may come back to that cost reward analysis. So a woman trying to help a man might feel like embarrassed, or like she's going to hurt herself or struggle. So remember, it said things in the qualitative comments like, it's for men to help him. Wish I could help, I just don't know what to do. Those kinds of things do seem to mimic that idea. And finally, in those mixed race groups, people are more likely to help those who are the same race as themselves, particularly if they deem the victim's situation to be of his own making. And a few more. So there is no strong relationship between the number of bystanders and the speed of helping. So like we said, there's no evidence in this study to support that idea of diffusion of responsibility. When escape is not possible and bystanders are face to face with a victim, help is likely to be forthcoming. So like it said, overall 79% of the time, which is fairly significant, spontaneous help was given because they can't just leave the situation. They can move areas, but they can't just leave the situation to decrease their arousal, therefore they're more likely to actually help. Bystanders conduct this cost-reward analysis before deciding whether or not to help the victim, and subsequent spontaneous help from others was irrespective of race or victim type. So once one person had helped, other people were more likely to then go and help.